Dream Tower Media presents The Literary Wonder and Adventure Show, hosted by Robert Zoltan, with Edgar the Raven.
Howdy do.
This episode, The Origins of Science Fantasy, a conversation with author Ryan Harvey. Hello, folks. Welcome to another thrilling episode of Literary Wonder and Adventure Show. I'm Robert Zoltan, your host, along with my lovable little feathered friend, Edgar the Raven.
Howdy do.
Edgar and I were just talking about how swimmingly our first Kickstarter campaign went. It was a smash success.
Yeah, man, we really kicked butt.
Well, I think that our supporters really kicked butt, the people that supported Ryan's novel and Dream Tower Media. I mean, without supporters like that, we couldn't publish great books like Turn Over the Moon by talented authors like Ryan Harvey. We couldn't keep this show going. We wouldn't be able to keep Dream Tower Media afloat. We
would have to get jobs.
Let us speak of it nevermore, old chum. Let's turn our minds to happier thoughts, such as the fact that Ryan Harvey is going to be on the show again.
He is? I didn't realize.
Yeah, in fact, he should be calling any minute. Oh, timing.
Pizza.
Answer it.
Howdy do, Dream Tower.
Hey, Dream Tower, this is Ryan calling.
Ryan, hey man, it's good to talk to you. Been a while since I heard your voice. I think the last time was our Clark Ashton Smith show, which was now quite a while ago. I actually moved since then.
Maybe 2 years.
No, that long. I think it was last spring. So I think it was like we did March or something like that.
Time has gone through an elasticity that makes it impossible for me to tell you when things happened.
Yeah. It's we're totally in a strange time warp right now due to the pandemic, and days seem to just linger on and roll into each other without much of a discernible difference, especially people like me who already have worked from home and do a variety of tasks that just go on.
I work from home as well.
Everyone's in that boat now. So congratulations are in order for, both of us, for Dream Tower Media and for you for our successful Kickstarter campaign, which we raised about twice the goal.
Twice.
Yeah.
And the book is now published as of today.
Yes, that's very exciting. Yeah, and we just want to give a sincere thanks to all the Kickstarter supporters that helped to make Turn Over the Moon a success.
Yes, and they're all going to be listed in the book. One of them is my cat. I donated $5 in her name. See if you can find her name in there. And
it's been a little bit of a road. Even though I'm a small publisher, we took a lot of time to prepare for this.
Yeah. I still to say this. I appreciate all the effort you did because you and I are on the same wavelength as far as we don't want anything done sloppily.
Yes.
We see a lot of pretty bad e-publishing going on, and quality was always top on our mind. That's one reason I can't be churning out 4 or 5 books a year. I wouldn't allow myself to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And there's another author that I won't mention the name at this point, but another really great author who I'm going to be publishing his classic series, Sword and Sorcery series. And And I just can't. I have to wait because, first of all, you can only do about 2 Kickstarters a year. They recommend, and you can't should do them sometime between March and November. So I mean, right there, I was already like delayed wanting to put his books out because of our release of your book, and then I have some of my own books coming out, and I've got Sexy Fantastic magazine starting in January 1st. So that's why you're really limited unless you've got a really big company. Even if you would, you just can't hit customers or readers with too much, at one time. And people that are going to be generous and want to give and support a book, 2 months later, they're probably not going to be ready to turn around and support another one. So you really got to take time and have patience.
That kind of goes back oddly to publishing in the 30s and 40s when publishers had this belief that an author couldn't have more than one book published per year, and so they asked their authors to use pseudonyms. That's why Cornell Woolrich, probably my favorite author of all time, started writing under the name William Irish during the 1940s because his publishers just said, we don't want to have 3 books by you out this year because that'll like dilute the market, which I don't think would have happened in the 40s. But it was because there was not as much dedication to single authors like as there are today. He could put out something that was quality under the name William Irish and people would buy it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You would think now that would be way more of a concern because there's so much material coming out, and yet it seems to be less of a concern, people putting out multiple books. And as you and I talked about just now, the quality being an issue, and yet people that are best-selling on Amazon that are putting out this just kind of churning out these templated, formulaic novels because Amazon forgets about you after 60 days and even starts to mostly forget about you after 30 days. So they're trying to put out one book every 2 or 3 months, which any good author can simply not do. There's barely ever
not do that unless you are if you're Max Brand, aka Frederick Faust, the guy who wrote over 500 novels in his lifetime during the 20s and 30s. And they're all really good, but that man was superhuman.
Well, there you go. You can name what? One?
Edgar Wallace, possibly. Edgar Wallace, I don't think is really very good. He's often listed as one of the great bad authors of all time. But I've read a lot of Frederick Faust's, Max Brand's work, and they're all at least of good, great quality. And this guy he could turn out a book in 5 days.
There certainly isn't any literary writer I can think of that did that, and even really good genre writers, like, not to separate the two, but what I'm saying, like with a genre, if it's a certain thing like detective fiction, there can be a certain amount of formula and audiences are fine with that. Hammett was probably a pretty fast writer. You probably know more about him than I do, but still, I'm sure he wasn't putting out that much work.
Yeah, and he was a fast writer until he almost stopped writing entirely, which is just one of those weird things. He burned out. He burned out. I could not tell you exactly what happened with Hammett. If he just got to the point where he realized that he was set for the rest of his life, he would keep himself in booze and cigarettes because of all the royalties from radio programs and things like that. And he just stopped. I mean, he stopped like after the Glass Key. It's pretty much like almost nothing for the rest of his life.
After the Glass Key, I always want to blame Hollywood. Because some of them, they go to Hollywood and then they're set up in that hotel. He was in that hotel for a while, right? And then it's like, I think that's just not conducive to a healthy creative life.
I think a lot of Hammett's creative direction in his later life was into Lillian Hellman's work.
Writing approximately around the same time was Grice Burroughs. A little bit earlier, I guess. He's a little bit, is he the same generation as Hammett, Burroughs, or a little bit older than him?
Oh, they're the same. They're the same generation. Burroughs started writing in 1912, and Hammett started writing in 1920. So Burroughs a little bit earlier. Burroughs died about 11 years before Hammett did, so we're approximately the same.
Hammett and Chandler was a little later, but Hammett was one of the people that kind of created the modern detective genre along with some other writers. So Black Mask was it all? It was mainly crime fiction, right?
Yeah, crime fiction, and they did occasionally dip into some more fantastical stuff. It was pretty rare, and they did have some horror material that showed up, but mostly it was hard. It was the center of hard-boiled detective writing, and Hammett Carol John Daly, Raoul Whitfield. Those were like the big names in the early days.
So, what was the? I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to kind of get on the string of science fantasy. So, what would you say was there a counterpart of for like science, the beginning of science fantasy or fantasy for in that genre as there was for Black Mask, or was it spread out more over?
It was spread out. There was no science fiction magazine appeared until the 1920s, in which you have Amazing Stories. That was the first science fiction magazine, and to that point, you would find science fiction and fantasy spread over the general interest pulps, like Argosy was one of the main ones. That's where Burroughs' stuff first appeared, and so you'd find it in the general interest pulps mostly, and they didn't have a real name for what this kind of work was. Sometimes it was called different fiction, which is a really exciting, thrilling name. It's up to Hugo Gernsback, who created Amazing Stories and was also a notorious cheapskate, who came up with the term first called scientifiction, which is just awful, and then came down to science fiction.
And science fiction at that point, was it very open in the definition of kind of what, or was it at that point more very much kind of, at least would have been thought of at that time as kind of hard science fiction, or was that more of a blanket term for science fiction and fantasy stories?
It was the Wild West as far as that period was concerned. There was,
that term, the idea of when they called it science fiction.
Yeah, when they first started calling it science fiction, it was probably closer to what we call space opera. Because the first real superstar of what we would call science fiction, when the name was established, the one that kind of caused Amazing Stories to blow up, was the Skylark of Space series by E.E. Smith, Doc Smith,
who created the Lensman series.
The Lens, which later the Lensman. First was Skylark. Skylark of Space was 1927, I believe, and that's when science fiction as a magazine genre completely blows up, because that was an insane success. That was the first time we have the scientists getting in the spaceship and then zooming across the galaxy and meeting alien creatures, and the ray guns come out, and just fast-paced, crazy scientific invention with high levels of adventure.
The fantastical, and it's not used very much, but that very much covers what you're getting from science fiction, because science fiction is never fact. It is based on science, based on what's going on now, and some of it tries to be hard science fiction to be accurate, but the truth is it's all speculation, speculative fiction, fantastical stuff. So it has to do with the imagination, and so do ghost stories. So we kind of go back. I was starting kind of near the beginning, but really depends how you look on it. I was almost assuming that Ed Grice Burroughs was one of the founders of science fantasy. I think that's probably true.
Yeah. And I'd say he and Abraham Merritt, Merritt.
Right. Okay. Yes. That's good. So what magazines were they being? Because of course back then mainly they were writing for magazines. They weren't publishing novels or something. Short stories were the lifeblood of literature at that point compared to novels, I would say. And what magazines were Ed Grice Burroughs and Merritt appearing in?
Merritt and Ed Grice Burroughs are mostly appearing in Argosy, All Story, and Blue Book magazine, which were at the time the top main interest pulp, what we call general interest pulps, which were going to start changing to a lot more specific interest pulps in the 20s.
1910s? Earlier than that, or what?
The general interest pulps are already established by the turn of the century. That's when, and Argosy was the very first pulp. And then you have Blue Book and Top Notch, and eventually get Adventure, but Adventure never strayed out of real into speculative fiction.
So let's if you don't mind, let's stay back there for a second. So was Conan Doyle in Argosy?
No, Conan Doyle was getting published in pre-pulp magazines. He was getting published in like regular London newspapers.
Yeah, he was about 10 or 20 years earlier than.
Yeah. He was being published in the same kind of magazines that were, or periodicals, I guess is the better way to call them, because they weren't truly magazines yet. The same periodicals that Charles Dickens was being published in.
When did Conan Doyle pass away?
Oh, actually, I don't remember exactly when he died.
When did he stop writing? When was his last stories come? Because he started writing more fantastical stuff.
Lost World,
the occult, and he was interested in the occult. Yeah, the Lost World.
The thing is, I'm not an expert on Arthur Conan Doyle at all.
Okay.
So I could not tell you exactly
Yeah,
the
I was just
decade.
no, I was looking for like a just decade. I'm fairly ignorant of. I know that he wrote he wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories in the mid kind of 1800s, mid late 18.
Late 1880s, 1890s, but they, all the way into the teens. He
Right.
was the casebook of Sherlock Holmes was one of the last one published. That was published in the teens. It may have been in early 1920.
So he
Um,
was contemporary with Edgar Allan Poe, pretty much
no, Poe died before Conan.
earlier.
Like in
Okay.
Poe died in the 1850s.
Oh
His
wow. Okay, I didn't realize that.
again, I can't tell you the exact date, but Poe's big decade was the 1840s.
Okay. It's interesting that see, I don't know these things, and then when you don't know, I mean, you can look at the language, and you can tell to a certain extent that Conan Doyle would be later. But the truth is, the reason these authors come together in my mind is that they seem to hold that these authors seem to hold a fascination because they all, even though Conan Doyle, well, some of his later work did bring in the occult. He became very interested in the paranormal and stuff. But Conan Doyle, Edgar Allan Poe, these really early authors were almost, to me, the progenitors of kind of fantasy, that gothic horror that morphed.
You could throw Bram Stoker in there as well.
Bram Stoker, of course, absolutely. Bram Stoker.
Aside from Dracula, he also wrote The Jewel of Seven Stars, which is one of the earliest Egyptian fantasy stories, one of the like proto-mummy stories, which has been adapted to film a bunch of times because, hey, it's in public domain now.
So that, go ahead. Or should I?
Hammer, Hammer adapted it first as a movie called Blood from the Mummy's Tomb.
Who did?
Hammer film.
Oh yeah, I've seen it. The woman's gorgeous, but the film isn't very good.
Well, that's because the director died while making it, and they had to switch over, and they lost their star 3 days into filming, and then one of the stuntmen died. The film had a whole bunch of problems.
I wanted to like that film so much. I think I tried to read it, and I couldn't really. I wasn't too thrilled with the story, but there's something about it that does seem to be a transitional spot to me. It's transitional. It's kind of turning point because you're dealing with horror, but it's also it's sort of like there's a combination of almost of Doyle. You know, you've got kind of some mystery element, and then you've got this horror element. You also got almost like a fantasy adventure going on, even though it's contemporary times.
It's unclear what the Egyptian princess is trying to do for the longest time, on how her power is being enacted, which makes it feel like there are no rules, and that kind of harms the suspense of it. I really do like Valerie Leone, even though they dubbed her voice. Hammer loved to dub their female stars for no reason whatsoever. And I also really do like James Villiers as the human villain. Just the perfect kind of snotty British guy.
But what do you think about what I'm saying about the idea of the genre of the story? It seems to me hold a fascination that it's slightly different than straight horror, and it's not a crime drama. It's kind of a combination of these things.
Yeah, and I'll say this, that the novel itself is not fantastic either.
That's what I didn't think so when I tried to read it, and I was not gripped.
It's better than Lair the White Worm, which is you can feel the mental illness is getting Stoker at that.
That I love Ken Russell's movie, which I'm sure is probably not. Who knows how? I don't know how. Probably very different from the book. I read about 3/4 of the book, and I found that I couldn't take it. I found it so irritating.
Stoker was dying.
Oh, I didn't know that.
There were mental issues going on. There's a lot of debate. There's some theory that he died of syphilis. I don't know how firm that is, but he was not firing on all cylinders when he wrote Lair of the White Worm.
I see. So these authors.
Doyle died in 1930. As I've.
Oh, did he? Wow, that late.
So died in 1849.
Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm just trying to reach back in a very subtle and not a very graceful way to try to reach back into finding what the roots of science fantasy. I didn't want to start with Burroughs because I feel, of course, it goes earlier than that. I mean, if you go back early enough, to me, the first trace of true science fiction, and you could call it science fantasy because there were gods and stuff, is the Iliad, when the Hephaestus having these metal or golden men and women that did his bidding. Yeah, and also there was Talos, the statue. So that's almost, I mean, I don't know if that'd be science fiction. To me, that's almost like science fantasy, because back then, I guess for them, that was the closest thing to technology, but it really was, they were powered by ichor or by whatever magic or.
And that's similar to the Gollum legend.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to tell when the Gollum legend really emerged. The most famous story takes place in the 16th century, but it may not have been written until the early 19th century. But we do know that Gollum legends was part of Jewish lore for a long time, and that is an artificial being that has life breathed into it, and it comes to life. And there is something about the idea of the robot in that. And then you get to Frankenstein.
Of course, you're right. Which is considered science fiction.
Considered science fiction, but if you read Shelley's original novel, there isn't a bit of science in it. They're really, when she talks about the creation of the monster, we don't know how it's done. It just gets done.
Right.
So there's often a suggestion that there may have been some sort of dark black magic or alchemy in creating the monster. So yeah, we think of the Frankenstein monster today and we see the big lab equipment.
Right.
That's not there in Shelley's novel. It seems like a person in a lab with a bunch of alchemical books and formulas. So, and the Gollum possibly influenced that.
The Gollum, yeah. That's what I was thinking of a few days ago when I was anticipating our conversation. My mind went to alchemy, because I was trying to find this either collision or chemical reaction between science and what is considered science, what's considered fantasy. So I thought about alchemy, not in the sense that alchemy is fantasy, but alchemy was a mystical approach to the transformation of the person. It wasn't about turning actual metal into gold. That would be a fool's errand. It was about all those things were esoteric symbols, meaning talking about the transformation of the soul.
Alchemy is like proto-chemistry.
In a sense, but it was a mysticism also. It was a spiritual pursuit. So you had this combination, like with maybe like Frankenstein, of the scientific approach of repetition and formula and observation and results, but then you had the fantastical or metaphysical or spiritual element. So I'm kind of trying to trace where did this come together? When did these two things that fascinated, obviously, as time went on, mankind has become more and more fascinated with machines that we are building and with science. And yet, and now we have this kind of combination in literature of these things that slowly happen, maybe a tiny bit in Edgar Allan Poe with some of his tales, with Bram Stoker, maybe with Conan Doyle to a certain extent, because Holmes was so much known as the scientific method, and then later his stories had the occult angle. And then we get to Ed Grice Burroughs, who, I mean, mostly, in a sense, his stories are science. We call them science fantasy. They don't really have any what we would call fantasy now in them, except that they are just so overblown and they have this epic fantasy feel. And the science is, of course, simply very soft science. It's just meant to create the devices.
Yeah, the Martian stories have high technology like radium guns and flying platforms, but everybody uses swords.
Right.
And they ride draft animals. So it's, yeah, that's...
did he ever talk about how those things came together for him?
It was one of those cases that he just pulled it out of his head. There had been some...
Right time and place.
Like Gulliver Jones, his Vacation, an earlier book may have had some influence on it. Some of it just came from his own cavalry experience. He just kind of threw in a lot of things. And a lot of it just came from resentment over what he thought was being printed at the time. It just wasn't interesting to him. And he says, here's what's interesting to me. What if send a guy to Mars? There was some knowledge about Mars at the time that was considered exciting, like the idea there might be canals on Mars, which we later found out was basically a lens flare problem, a bad lens, and came up with this. Because there were no rules at the time, no one had defined science fiction or really fantasy at all. There wasn't anything holding him back to just say, yeah, we can have radium guns and flying platforms and still have the hero on the ground slaughtering people with a sword.
Right. It seems like an obvious idea, doesn't it? And yet nobody had done it because it just wasn't the right time. I mean, he had already, things like Alexander Dumas' work of the Three Musketeers. You had all these swashbuckling things. Then you had, and now, do you know when H.G. Wells was in comparison to Burroughs?
H.G. Wells was started in the 1890s. Like, for instance, War of the Worlds was published in, I believe, 1899.
So he had that to draw on, too. If you combine War of the Worlds with the Three Musketeers, you're going to get something that could possibly end up being like, except that he has the Earthman go to Mars instead of having the Martians come here. He could have easily had the Martians come here and have people fighting them with swords back in the 1600s or something. It would have been fascinating.
I think the reason he just would have done that is he just liked the idea of getting to this big desert area that he could play around with and make up his own adventures. And plus, he liked the idea of having an outsider character, a character if he was going to have to explain a world to you, he'd rather put someone who didn't know it on that world so he could go through it step by step, which was already something pretty common to, say, H. Rider Haggard's work. She is a good example, and she is another important fantasy.
Yeah, another almost science fantasy novel. So it looks like it. I mean, the earliest what we would call modern science fantasy really starting to form would be Ed Grice Burroughs, especially his Mars books, and H. Rider Haggard.
But I think we have to really stress the importance of A. Merritt.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot A. Merritt. Absolutely, yeah.
Abraham Merritt, who was a newspaper, I believe it's a newspaper editor and journalist, but also became, from the late teens to the 20s, one of the most popular authors on the planet. He, for someone who's vanished almost completely from readers, it's kind of hard to explain how popular Merritt was. He got popular enough that there was a magazine dedicated just to reprinting his work eventually in the 1930s. So his work, like The Moon Pool, was his big breakthrough work. That is absolutely the definition of science fantasy because it begins almost like a horror story, a slow exploration of ruins, and then the characters are rocketed to an entirely other realm. And then it becomes the swashbuckling Irish heroic adventurer who falls in love with the queen and fights the evil creatures. And it included a lot of crazy science. And same thing with the metal monster that followed up. And then you have the Ship of Ishtar, which is a lot more fantasy oriented, but still uses scientific explanations for how certain things are happening.
Yeah, there's always an element of a change in an altered consciousness that gets the character, even in some of his shorter work. It's not like a scientific device. It's always staring at a tapestry, or something like that, where the character seems to go into a strange state, and that's how they end up in this other place.
Well, that's for Ship of Ishtar. With like Metal Monster, they just find an area, a remote area. It's a Lost World story.
But several of the others are more like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there is this idea of a dreamlike quality to it, and I don't get that from Burroughs. I mean, you do kind of, like, you're not sure how. It is very mystical. John Carter puts his arms up. It has more to do with longing. And I think that's what he was interested in from his work, was heroism and longing and all that. But yeah, Merritt kept his work. Well, other dimensions, but it's not really other planet. Is there other planets?
It's like often underground realms.
Yeah.
A good example would be, and I would say probably his best novel, The Face in the Abyss, which is a lost world underground civilization ruled by snake people. Yeah, it's crazy. But like a lot of Merritt's work, it always starts grounded in a very documentary style of writing and then goes nuts.
I think that I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I think that there's a psychological meaning to that in a sense. Both Burroughs and Merritt were very much, they obviously had a romanticism about the old world type of person or man. If you look at John Carter, even for his time, he's an old-fashioned type of man.
Yes.
And
Merritt's characters were usually Irish adventurers.
Yes, and so it's a very manly, a very harkening back to a simpler, possibly more primitive but more honest time. not too crazy about civilization, just like Robert E. Howard, a sense
And
of
it played into U.S. readers' kind of attitude about the Irish, which is, the Irish were kind of,
fighting men and
yeah, they were
drinkers. Yeah.
still kind of, they were very, there was a lot of prejudice against the Irish during the 19th century, and it bled over into this idea that Irishness is rugged, tough individualism, and you don't want to cross them.
Yeah,
So
right.
they were very popular for. I mean, look, Howard loved those characters too, Robert E. Howard. So yeah, that was like one of the popular archetypes was the two-fisted, brawling Irish adventurer.
Right, and that's also what I was going to say about the psychological aspect of it is that Merritt's characters, it's like it's a traveling from the conscious to the subconscious realm kind of. And that kind of character who's that rugged and more primitive, they're not depending on the intellect and the conceptual mind to solve problems and use science and all that. So it's really, and like you said, his character, it's often the face in the abyss or whatever. It's like deep under the earth, which is very symbolic to me of the underworld and other dimensions, which is like the dimension of dreams. Whereas Burroughs is a little less complicated to me, even though it's mystical with John Carter. Merritt to me seems like a subconscious thing of like the characters going down into this world of the subconscious almost.
I've often said that Burroughs is kind of the master of the daydream story, where Merritt would be more into the night dream kind of story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Burroughs dreams with his eyes wide open in the daylight.
And there are nighttime scenes, but you picture Mars very well lit. You know, you just picture Mars as a bright, energetic place. And I think you're absolutely right about that. So we would say, so Merritt.
He could definitely plunge into the darkness. If you look at the first Pellucidar novel, At the Earth's Core, the scene of the Mahars hypnotizing and eating people in their underground caverns is just an astonishing sequence.
See, I'm not as familiar with the other work, so he may have written that. Say he did also write stuff that took place in the center of the earth or underground.
Yeah, but that's broad daylight too, because once you're up you're out of the caverns in At the Earth's Core, you're in eternal sunlight. Because that's how
he even brought it there somehow.
Yeah, in that case, that's because it's used for him to erase time.
And Conan Doyle, The Lost World. I don't know too much about it apart from probably some little movie versions, but is that pretty much just an attempt at a science fiction, right?
Yeah, it is probably the prototypical Lost World novel because, well, hey, it has Lost World in the title. It wasn't the first, but when you think of a Lost World adventure, a scientific expedition goes out to a distant place in South America, finds a plateau which has dinosaurs and cavemen on it. Mm-hmm. And they bring an animal back. In the book, they bring back, I believe it's a pterodactyl, and it escapes during an exhibition and flies off. In the movie, they went hardcore. They brought back a brontosaurus, and it gets to stomp things.
Okay.
Thus, the beginning of one of the greatest genres of all time, the giant monster movie.
The giant monster movie. So it looks like the beginnings of it may be very much Merritt at least as much as Burroughs then, and H. Rider Haggard a little bit. Sort of started opening up this kind of this vista of combining science with these fantastical adventures that weren't taking place necessarily in outer space, but were dealt with in a more simpler setting or more what's a word I want to use, uncivilized setting.
Yeah, and this is when we're getting into the 20s when Merritt is really popular. Burroughs is still doing a lot of work, but is not quite at his peak anymore as he was in the teens. And now you have the emergence of what we now are defining as science fiction with the work of Doc Smith. And this is when you start getting the difficulties of defining science fiction, science fantasy, and fantasy, because I would say that Skylark of Space and Lensman and all of Doc Smith's work are absolutely science fiction. They are very focused on science. Slide rules or how they're moving things around, but they discuss how all these various engines work and inertialist drives and things like that. But the adventures are also just crazy.
But that is a hallmark of science fiction, a focus on the method, on the science itself, on the technology, whereas fantasy is not concerned with that. it may mention it. Well, I mean, there's different types of science fiction too. Philip K. Dick was an amazing science fiction writer, but he was not interested in the technicalities of hard science fiction. Yeah.
No, that's the same thing for Frank Herbert and the Dune novels.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
But
That's a
I
little
think
spiritual.
science-
Like, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, science. I mean, they do mention some scientific aspects of it, but they're not really. He's not really interested in telling you how las guns work. Um, it's spiritual and political is what he's principally.
Yeah. Mystic and also mystical. Dune wouldn't really be considered a science fantasy, though. What is it that we think of now? Because you could have science fantasy and you could have it take place in present times, and you could call that there could be a science fantasy. But the science fantasy that we're talking about, and the science fantasy a little bit that your book is, Turn Over the Moon, it's kind of hard to categorize because without giving away anything, I mean, it does take place on another planet. Or the people come from another world. There is a element of other worlds. There is an element of travel through space. For the people who live on this planet, came from somewhere, or they're on this planet that's a strange world. So there's a science.
I think the reference point I want to use there, because it's probably the one that most people are familiar with, is the Dragon Riders of Pern series. That's one of the. I think that's a very key science fantasy novel because it is. A dragon is right in the title. The main characters ride dragons and train them, and they shoot fire, and they live in these villages. And yet, these are people who are. We found out later. This is actually not like an alternate Earth. It's another planet. And
Pern is the planet, right?
Pern is the planet. These people are descendants of a long forgotten group of Earth colonists. Eventually, McCaffrey went and wrote those early novels. About the original founders of the planet. And the dragons are just the native species. They just look like dragons and were called dragons because that's what people were familiar with. And the monsters they're fighting, the threads, are just objects being sent down by a nearby, I think it's a nearby star. I haven't read the book in a couple of years. I really love that book, but it's been a while. That due to occasional this planet's occasional nearing of another celestial body, it shoots down these deadly objects down into the planet, which the dragons can eliminate.
So that McCaffrey, she wrote that in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s?
I'd say probably early 70s is when.
Yeah, so we're jumping a bit from Merritt and the work of Merritt and Burroughs. We're missing about a 30-year period. I would also say that Moorcock was before her, and
Moorcock, yeah.
Moorcock wrote some science fantasy, very much science fantasy.
Yeah, the Runestaff, the Hawkwind.
The Eternal Champion, the first book, The Eternal Champion, has science fantasy elements. I mean, it's not like they're elves and stuff. These are like alien races. He's dealing with other dimensions. Even in Elric, what I really love about the dragons is the dragons are very real creatures. They're not these fanciful.
I'll say that I borrowed a word from the Eternal Champion, that book. The race that Eric Cozy is first fighting and later then sides with is called the Eldrin.
Mm-hmm.
And the Shapers in my series, their racial name for themselves is Eldru.
Oh, that's where you got that. Okay.
I'm pretty sure I know exactly when I was coming up with that name. I said I always liked the name Eldrin. Moorcock was making a reference to elves. That's
yes.
What he was.
He was, and the Melniboneans. I mean, I don't know where he came up with that name. It's fantastic, but they're very much a race. He's trying to take what Tolkien did as elves, and which was a throwback to folklore and legend and myth, and Moorcock was in a way almost making it a science fiction thing. Like, this is a race, this is an actual race, and they live and they have a civilization, they have a past.
Probably inspired by Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword, which is a fantasy novel, but the elves in there have a weakness to metal that is indicated to be sort of a science fiction-like weakness that they have.
Do you think that's because he was a science fiction writer also and a science fan?
I think we should talk about Paul Anderson briefly here because he's kind of important for this conversation. Paul Anderson primarily is identified as a science fiction writer, but his journeys into fantasy are important science fantasy because they are on the science fiction side of the science fantasy equation. When talking about science fantasy, I like to distinguish that there's kind of two different directions you can go. You either have a science fiction story that is acting like it is fantasy, or you have a fantasy story that that has rules and logical approaches to its magic that makes it seem like science fiction. And with the fantasy that Paul Anderson wrote, such as Operation Chaos being his big one, he took fantasy and gave it distinct logical analysis. It was analyzed magic. This is true for Three Hearts and Three Lions, where each time they encounter a monster, there is a scientific discussion about why the monster does certain things. For example, the troll that regenerates. The regenerating troll, which D&D later picked up for their trolls, and now it's kind of a standard thing that trolls regenerate. Mm-hmm. That was from Three Hearts and Three Lions, and the hero has to explain to him how it is that the troll is able to regenerate. Broken Sword is kind of the only novel that Paul Anderson wrote before those books that was very strongly mostly fantasy, but with a little bit of the science fantasy elements. But then you have Operation Chaos and Three Hearts and Three Lions, and it's highly explained fantasy. Operation Chaos is World War II fought with dragons and magicians. And then there's also the lives of the two main characters afterwards as they work for a college campus and do things like have to arrange for the magicians to do the fireworks ceremony for the homecoming. So it's what we would call, I think the best term for it I've heard is logical fantasy.
Well, that's the same time as the Complete Enchanter too. Right?
Same thing, yeah. The Elsbreg de Camp and Fletcher Pratt. Mm-hmm. Very similar. And I would say today that a lot of fantasy does fall into this category. I think the Harry Potter series absolutely is analyzed fantasy because they go to school, they learn it. There's very strict rules and laws on how things operate. That is analyzed. That I'm going to call Harry Potter series science fantasy, but it does fall into the analyzed fantasy category.
Which I find really, to me, takes away the magic. Unless it's a really, really good writer.
As a science fantasy writer myself, I am on the other side of the equation. I like the science fiction setting in which the science fiction looks and seems like magic to everybody. That's the
what did you mean by the other side of the equation?
The other side of the equation is a fantasy story in which the fantasy is logically analyzed.
Oh, right. These are the two you mentioned at the start.
Yeah. This is
state those again. I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, so science fantasy can be looked at as two broad camps, but of course there's lots of overlaps. So take these as just two broad ideas. There is science fantasy, in which approaches from the fantasy approach, which is supernatural setting, but the supernatural world is treated and analyzed in a scientific fashion.
Scientized, kind of.
Yeah, scientized or sufficiently analyzed. Any sufficiently analyzed magic is indistinguishable from science. I'm reversing Arthur C. Clarke.
Yes, yeah, right. Which Arthur C. Clarke said, go ahead and quote it if people that don't know.
Any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
And then I just stated the corollary, which any significantly analyzed magic is indistinguishable from science.
So what's the other kind of broad camp of science fantasy? That is the science fiction novel that has fantasy trappings or a fantasy feel, or?
Yeah, the science aspects are usually so outrageous to the main characters that it does feel like a fantasy to them.
And that's Turn Over the Moon would fall a little more into that.
It falls in that category because this is a world that anybody who starts reading it will. I've had people start reading it and say, this feels like a fantasy novel to me. And I said, well, wait a little bit. And then they start reading and go, well, there's dinosaurs. I don't associate dinosaurs with fantasy novels. Dinosaurs are real. And then technology starts to appear. And they call it the art. They don't ever use the term science. That term does not appear to exist to them. But there's definitely things like, well, when you're in a novel that seems to be a fantasy story in which you have very medieval technology, and then somebody picks up a shotgun, things change. And the shotgun is terrifying to everybody except for a few people.
I love that aspect of your novel. Actually, I think that's really fascinating that people feel that way. They have this emotional reaction or fear.
That relates also to just the sorrow, to the depression aspect. Right. That science is actually literally terrifying to most people. They just don't. It's scary. It's witchcraft.
And yet the truth is, in our modern society, people don't have enough of a horrified reaction to someone holding a shotgun in their hands. I think that we become far too used to it.
we're used to seeing it in movies. There's a scene in Turn Over the Moon where I really wanted to emphasize what it would be like for someone to actually have to point a gun at someone for the first time in their life, and what the person on the other end would feel about it, knowing that they don't really know much about this thing. It's considered devil work. It's super dangerous, and they don't quite know what's going to happen when they pull that trigger.
And I think that's one of the real credits to your novel is that when I read it the first time, I don't feel like there's a lot of things assumed. I think that's where books are crippled by tropes. It's fine to use devices and things that are used in other books. We all use the same words if we're using a certain language. But it's like, how does a great writer seem to, there's a great writer and a terrible writer, and they're using the same words. Well, how do they use the words? And when, in your book with these elements that are maybe science fantasy elements or fantasy elements, instead of taking this assumption that this is how a person feels because we've seen it in a movie a million times, or this is how other people have treated it in books. Well, you know what a robot is. You know what this is. Who is it that said, Rainer Maria Rilke, I think it's in Letters to a Young Poet. I'm pretty sure it is. And he basically tells him, try to describe like the sky or the clouds or all that as if you have never seen them before.
Yeah, man, it's great advice, and good luck.
It's very difficult, but that's what you were doing in Turn Over the Moon. A lot of people write these scenes. It's just like, you get the gun and whatever, and like you're analyzing, what does it mean to feel fear about these things? What does it mean to feel depression? What does it mean to have a gun pointed at you? Because it's not really treated realistically in most media, in my opinion. And when I say realistically, I'm talking about the impact emotionally upon a human being, the meaning of it for our lives, not how a gun works or whatever.
I've seen movies, obviously guns are everywhere in movies. We're just used to seeing people in big action films shoot like crazy. But there are sometimes in some movies, really good ones, where you feel the impact of someone holding a gun on somebody else. And one of my favorite examples is Unforgiven. The finale of Unforgiven really brings down the weight of having a gun held in your face. I've looked at a lot of my writing, and I think that Unforgiven gets in there a lot. And
interesting.
I absolutely had that scene, William Money holding the gun on Bill Daggett. When I wrote that scene with the blast gun in Turn Over the Moon, I kept remembering the tension in the movie theater when I first saw that film at that scene, and feeling like I was just about to break apart with how incredibly riveting this sequence was. And I wanted to capture something of that in that scene. Because
you and I have been lucky enough not to have to experience these kind of things, as many generations before us have had to go to war and deal with these.
I don't know what it's like to hold a shotgun. The character in the novel doesn't really know either, and it's not even called a shotgun. It's not. I specifically have the name shotgun used later as a defining point. When someone says, "Can you pick up the rifle?" What do you mean rifle? That thing right there. Oh, you mean the blast gun? It's just a little linguistic moment where the reader goes, "Oh, hold it. That's been defined. Someone else knows more about this."
And also, I think what's good about not calling it that is that, again, it gets the reader, like what I said about Rilke's quote, you want to get the reader to as if they're experiencing these things for the first time. Those of us who are trying to write really good fiction, the whole point is you're trying to give the reader a new experience. You're trying to give the reader, it goes beyond words. We're trying to entertain, but also you're trying to give someone something that's worth reading, that is thoughtful, that makes you think about your life, reality, your emotions, makes you experience them along with the character, so the character feels real. Otherwise, any victory is cheap. If it's just easily done. That's why I can't watch any stuff or read any stuff with the cocksure hero that's doing flips and smiling, killing people. It's like I have no interest, or even if they're not smiling, I just have no interest. I'm interested in the character like that, who's got to hold that gun for the first time and decide whether or not to shoot this person to save someone else. These are real issues that confront our strip away things and get down to what we really feel and what it means for us to be human, and to have friends and to love someone or to hate someone. And that's what we're all trying to figure out each day, these things. And the other stuff is just fine to be escapist. So going back, like I said, there was a little bit of a space, space between like Merritt and Burroughs, and we were talking about. So Paul Anderson would kind of fit in that space, 40s through the 60s.
He starts to really break out in the 50s with Broken Sword and Three Hearts and Three Lions.
And so he kind of was doing something, but that was still the idea of science fantasy. Well, there was, like you said, the Complete Enchanter, Fletcher Pratt and Elsbrog de Camp, and then there's Paul Anderson.
I think it really takes the new wave in the 60s to start.
Yeah.
Because at that point, we break away from the golden age that was being what's called the golden age of science fiction, which is the one that's dominated by the Astounding Science Fiction magazine and John W. Campbell and his group of writers. And you do have the very science based version of science fantasy in Unknown magazine that he edited. That is a lot. That's where the Fletcher Pratt and Elsbreg de Camp, Howard Chase stories, the Complete Enchanter stories were published. Unknown is the magazine, Unknown, also known as Unknown Worlds, which is where also the first Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories appeared, is a core for that kind of science fantasy that's on the science side. John W. Campbell wanted to emphasize with his writers for that magazine that he didn't want Weird Tales stuff. He wanted his group of writers who were writing in astounding science fiction to come over to this magazine and apply the same kind of logical approach. Like, you could not have gotten, Weird Tales would not have purchased Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. That was Unknown's territory, even though, as a library fan, you know this, Campbell didn't like those stories. But he kept saying, well, people will keep reading these things, Fritz, so I guess I'll keep publishing them. But the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, although they're not logical fantasy, they have a much more urbane, modern, humorous quality to them than what you were finding in Weird Tales.
Yeah, they're a little more. Well, we were talking about psychology. Leiber was very interested in psychology and was well versed in Jungian psychology. Well, with Leiber, with the fantasy in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, you were saying urbane has a very mystical. You're talking about alchemy. It has a very mystical feel to it. Leiber's magic. There aren't any rules. The magic is very dangerous and uncontrollable. Thank God he didn't put any rules down for it. And I mean, people say that, pointing to Vance like that, but the truth is, Jack Vance's magic was very, very mysterious too, compared to what people do now.
I think the reason Vance gets qualified like that is because Vance's magic system was used for the basis of D&D.
Yeah, and they call it Vance's magic system. There was no magic system. What it was is that there were a bunch of magicians, and they were great at one time, and they put down all these spells, and then you can hold some in your brain, and it hurts your brain if you hold more, and that's it. That's all Vance talked about.
We should be talking about Vance anyway. Vance is another huge one because...
Oh my gosh! Yes, I'm sorry. I accidentally brought him up, and of course,
this is where I want to get into what I was mentioning earlier. The new wave period.
Well, the dying Earth, of course. Oh,
when we get to the 60s and Moorcock and Vance, we now have people who are tossing out John W. Campbell's insistence that everything must be based in science and be realistic. So we're moving away from the territory of the Asimovs and the Clarks. No disrespect to their writing, fantastic writers, also Heinlein. And suddenly we're getting people like Jack Vance and Michael Moorcock.
Let me insert something there. I think it's because there was a real romance with science, especially at the beginning, the turn of the century. And we thought that science was going to solve all our problems and everything. And then we found out that science was creating just as many horrors as it was solving, or as many horrors it was defeating, or however you want to put it. It's a dualistic thing. There's two sides of the coin, and that's what they realized. Science isn't this wonderful thing. We're going to have robots to service, and housewives that are going to have all the technological equipment to help them in the home. And that the new wave, that's why it starts getting thrown out, because in the 60s, it was very much a product of the 60s, which was a time of revolution, a time of rethinking everything.
Yeah,
but before we go into that, Vance is earlier, because The Dying Earth is like 1949.
Yeah,
or came out in 49.
But he just kept writing through the 60s and
sure. But what I want to say was, I mean, it's so how we have blind spots on the left and right. There's those two blind. Talk about a blind spot. We're having this conversation, and I didn't even think of Vance, who is one of my 3 favorite fantasy writers of all time. It was like blind spot.
As important as science as there is to science fantasy.
Absolutely.
Not just Earth, but the planet of adventure.
So much of his work was across.
The Last Castle, the Dragon Mask.
Yes. People that haven't read, if there's anyone listening to this that hasn't read The Dying Earth takes place like so far in the future that it is a fantasy world. But I mean, it's millions of years in the future. The sun is dying. It's a wonderful idea that creates this somber, almost what you think of as Ray Bradbury-esque sometimes mood of this dark afternoon sunset.
So fake.
Clark Ashton Smith, and I was going to talk about him too. That's another person I wanted to talk about.
People have often assumed that The Dying Earth was inspired directly by Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique stories, but Vance has said it wasn't really the case. But nonetheless, they're very similar. It's far in the future that science is gone, magic has come back, but magic isn't exactly the new science either. It's not really effective.
Yeah, I think that Smith and Clark Ashton Smith and Jack Vance, as much as they were absolutely and completely, almost diametrically different writers. I mean, there's times when Vance reminds me of Hammett almost. You know, the simplicity of his writing, yet he had amazing style and
He could be hard-boiled. He could definitely be hard-boiled.
Yeah, so very different, and yet I do feel there's a little bit of a kinship there. I mean, Vance didn't have the horror element like Smith did, but they both had this idea of where you feel like science and fantasy were two things that were just like, they were kind of flowing back and forth. Weird science and fantasy or magic that's got some strange arcane method behind it that's can be controlled or something, or it comes from a far distant past or is in a far distant future, and those are science fictional elements.
And the term Dying Earth became one of the key subgenres of science fantasy. Dying Earth is just one of the types of science fantasy, and probably I'd say the dominant one, which is the post-apocalypse science fantasy story. That's where I think by the time we get into the 70s and 80s, the dominant form of science fantasy is it's in the future. Science still exists, but it's gotten weird. Everything's been mutated, that kind of thing.
The wonderful thing about Vance is that he put it so far in the future, we don't have to deal with the pessimistic post-apocalyptic feel. The world does seem morose, and everybody thinks the sun is about to go out, but there isn't a feel of that depressing Mad Max thing. It's more of a melancholy longing.
Yeah, and
a beautiful feeling.
Well, thank you for describing my novel. I mean, this is what I was aiming for when I began writing these, not Turn Over the Moon specifically, but the setting. I was mostly entranced more by Zothique than by Jack Vance, honestly. Zothique talks a lot about, the Zothique stories talk a lot about decadence. People are at the end of time and everybody's just sort of given over to decadence. There's not much hope, but then hope needs that. I just sort of extrapolated that and began thinking about the concept of depression and bumped it up. I already had the setting sort of, but at that point it was just, I have dinosaurs and some tech stuff, and I tried writing a story. It failed, and it was for another 5 or 6 years before I actually tried the setting again. And this time I had the sorrow, the idea of this depression that affects everyone, and suddenly the story started to work.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So I had an Grice Burroughs setting that needed to get Jack Vance and Clark Ashton Smithized.
Yeah, and I think more than anything, you needed to bring your own understanding of life, of your own life into it.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to even talk about these things in a way. It sounds very trite to say, but whenever a writer like Hammett, he wrote about what he knew, and it wasn't just that he knew the detective field, but he knew how people acted. He knew how people deceived each other. He knew how the emotions. You understand certain emotions. You understand certain things. And once a writer really brings a talented writer, takes a writer with skill, brings that personal element, is willing to be vulnerable to deal with subjects that are close to them, whether it makes them happy or uncomfortable or all the different emotions it does. That's when I think a writer starts to write something of note. And I would say that the best stories I have written, I mean, the Rogues of Merritt stories, they're very good, but the thing is, those bring in my personal life just as much as the literary. I wrote literary stories about my childhood. My ex-girlfriend had told me, she's like, you should write about all these things, because I would share with her things that had troubled me, the things that had happened. And I was like, I have no interest in writing about the past, no interest. But I listened to her, and I started to, and I wrote about 15 stories, and they're the best thing I've ever written. And what came out, because when you're willing to be vulnerable, you can transform those experiences. You can transform memories. You can transform your own emotions through fiction. And in Rogues of Mirth, I deal with, even though it's sword and sorcery adventure, not to go off and talk about my own work, but all the things that are in there are very personal. And, people read it and they say, oh, it kind of reminds me of Robert E. Howard, or it's got a little bit of this or a little bit of that, reminds me of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. But so few people talk about the depth of the stories is about this friendship between Darien and Blue, which is really me and my older brother in a way, but changed. And the subjects that go on with dealing with, coming to middle age and passing that, dealing with death in one of the stories in a very concrete way of death personified that Darien encounters. And so there's, without those things, those stories would just be very trite fantasy stories. But any story ends up being that way unless we were willing to bring ourselves into it. Well, all of this talk of, I think that science fantasy and all these writers who we've talked about had that in common, skilled writers who brought their own personal loves and fears and longings and everything into their work. Seems that we have chronicled it fairly, maybe only in a very light way. Of course, you could write books about it, but from the idea of the late 1800s and Poe and Stoker and Conan Doyle, up through Burroughs and into the 20th century writers we talked about through Moorcock brings us, Moorcock's still alive. After the 60s, in the 70s, that stuff that Moorcock wrote and other writers, I think that then writers just began to play, those things became established. So many of these things became established and have become tropes. And now it's just subgenres of all these things, so that it's really almost ridiculous. There are such subgenres, like you say, of the dying Earth scenario or whatever. But now there's subgenres beyond that. I think that people get a little too caught up in this idea that they think that that's where the magic lies, and that's not where the magic lies. The magic lies in the talent of the author to draw upon his own understanding of his life and of life in general and humanity and earth, the earth and existence, and bring that into the work. And the trappings, as we can see from great writers, it didn't matter what they could have written about anything. They could have changed the detective into a soldier or whatever. Still would have been a great book. Still would have been the guy would still been a great writer. And I think that's the key, is that through all these things, I was just interested in this idea of where science and fantasy came, where did they come from? How did they collide? Again, could write a long book about it. But coming to the present time, that is where your book, the closest thing we feel general genre we would give it is science fantasy. But it's basically just drawing upon all the things that you love and the things that are challenging to you in life, and putting your main character into those situations and into this world that also is an incredibly thrilling one, that's exciting and can take the reader along into an adventure, and to an adventure that doesn't just have a conclusion of trying to kill some outward evil, but for her to change and to grow and to transcend what she was.
Something that was really important for me when writing about these sorrowless characters is to emphasize with people that these are not superhuman happy people.
Right.
They, as Belda says at one point, says, I'm afraid of the world because of what's in it, not just because the world exists.
Right.
I think that was kind of an important statement for explaining what was different between this. This is not a person who has no fear. I actually once read a novel about a story about a character who did not have the fear gene, and that was boring.
Well, that story could end pretty quickly when they walk across the street and get hit by a truck. But depending on if, but I don't want it to make it sound like your story, your world or your novel is a downer. I think it is a very dark world in some ways, but I really feel that it's also very hopeful. So, in a sense, the world suffers from this weight of depression and sorrow, but certain people don't, and they have enough courage and take it upon themselves, or that's just who they are, to see if they can actually transform the world itself somehow, find a cure in some way for this.
There also is, and this is where Holzer is important, which is that if Belda went on this story with just her dinosaur sidekick, and hey, I love Rint, but Rint is a dinosaur and isn't dealing with the same problems that humans deal with, she has to have Holzer, because the romance story in there, which even though it develops pretty subtly, I would say, has the idea of finding someone that you can grip onto in a world that is dangerous and sad and oppressive. it's the forging of their relationship throughout the book is the key thing to me, because it's a sorrowless person learning to deal with someone who has just the sorrow around them all the time, and someone with the sorrow who is clearly in love with the sorrowless person but thinks that they will never accept them. Just getting to that point, finally getting to that point between the two of them.
I think that Holzer represents the real hope there, because if Belda is who she is, and if she goes on the adventure alone, well, she's this sorrowless person. But Holzer represents the hope of the world. If he can change, if he can overcome these things, even still with the sorrow, there's hope that some change, or at least the world can continue, or people can find some kind of meaningful life despite this thing they're suffering from. And the fact that he goes with her, he's really the kind of the crux, the turning point. If she can help him, or if they can find the cure for him, then he represents the world more than she does. She represents the potential of the world.
There's also Quarrel. Quarrel is the other person who provides us with a more philosophical point of view for someone who has the sorrow, because he's not even supposedly human, and comes from a race that is viewed by most as just being flat out evil.
He's so far into it that they've given into the sorrow, and it's become almost like their religion.
Yeah, and for him, he says, like, actually having heartbreak is a relief for him, because it's a pain that does not come from the sorrow. And I gotta say, that's something I've felt personally before, where sometimes if there's things that are troubling you in the world, sometimes having a personal heartbreak is kind of a relief. It's just you; it's not the world. It's just something maybe you can deal with it. So it's I know that's kind of a dark idea of hope, but that's kind of the core of what Quarrel really is, kind of brings to the story.
Well, heartbreak is a terribly difficult thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Heartbreak is what often transforms people from being total jerks or being young as they grow older into someone who has the possibility for compassion. I was thinking this morning on a walk, I know this young woman, and I just thought, they're pretty, but I really have no interest in, there are some young women who are very mature, but it's very rare, and you still lack the experience usually. But comparing a woman who's like in her early 20s to a woman who's like 40, I'm so much more attracted probably because of my age, but emotionally, because the woman has had her heart broken. That was one thought that I had. She's had loss. That creates a tenderness in your heart. If you haven't had your heart broken, if you haven't suffered, then it's very hard to have compassion. Those things have the potential to create compassion and empathy in us. They don't always for people. They can become more bitter and they can close themselves up. But the truth is, when you've had your heart broken or you've had some certain suffering, when someone else has that, you can empathize with them. That doesn't mean you need to give them some kind of intellectual advice. It has nothing to do with that. It's that they can really feel you're present with them and they're not alone because you have experienced it. That's a thing that can be considered almost evil that can be turned into good, because it is extremely painful. But I don't look back on having my heart broken in pain from the times I did, and I look at it as changing me quite a bit, especially the first time or second time when I was married of having my heart broken. That really changed me. I really became a little bit less of a self-centered asshole. It can really wake you up when you're close to someone and they hurt you, and probably maybe even because you deserved it. Then that something happens to us that's pretty hard to put into words, hard to define. But that does happen to the characters in your book.
Yeah, Belda's heartbreak started before the book.
Yeah, yes, in Farewell to Turn.
Yeah. Her
Farewell to Turn, which is available right now on dreamtowermedia.com for free if you sign up for the mailing list. Go and you can read the prequel to the wonderful novel Turn Over the Moon. It's a great short story to start with, and then you can also pick up for just 99 cents An Acolyte of Black Spires, which is also a prequel. Not sure if doesn't really matter that it takes place.
It's a sidequel.
It takes place actually even before the Farewell to Turn, but it's not about Belda. Yeah,
it takes place in between Farewell to Turn and Turn Over the Moon, but it deals with supporting characters.
Right, but very, very excellent story, which won the Writers of the Future Award.
So won the Writers of the Future Award, and let me tell you, That was a shock because that short story was not written with the intention that it would be published so early. When I created the setting, we created Antarctica, I had my villains, the Shapers, the Eldru. I had written a couple stories, and they were always lurking in the background. I thought I should probably write a story for myself exploring them, who they are, and the story about them. So I wrote that story and thought, if any of these stories ever get published, it'll probably be the last one. Sent it to the Writers of the Future contest, and it won, and it became the first one published.
The good thing is it doesn't give away anything. There's no spoiler for Turn Over the Moon. And so some
very, very odd that this is the world, the curtain opens up, here are the bad guys.
It definitely is like an episode that it is in the middle. But, well, anyway, Ryan, it was great having you on the show. And I think I'm actually we got a little farther than I hoped we would in trying to trace the roots of science fantasy or what it is. And of course, the definitions we have are loose, but
let's mention Gene Wolfe here just while we're at it. The book of the new sun, just for another science fantasy.
Apologies to any authors we're leaving out, because there definitely were others that contributed. And you can look at
David Lindsay, Lee Brackett, C.L. We all love you.
I was going to say C.L. Moore, who wrote the science fiction and the fantasy, and they both were exactly the same. Anyway, let's just another... Roger Zelazny. I was going to talk about Roger Zelazny about 15 minutes ago.
Diane DeWan's Young Wizard series. If you give up on Harry Potter, read Diane DeWan's The Young Wizards. It's science fantasy. It's so much fun.
There you go. I think we covered it as well as we can in this time. So again, we'll talk about Turn Over the Moon. Again, thanks to the Kickstarter backers who helped us to start out this novel release, in the black instead of in the red, and with no funds, because folks, a big publisher, any of the important authors, they're putting tens, hundreds, thousands of dollars, millions of dollars behind a book. We don't have that. We've got a book that's just as good as any big publisher book that's coming out. As I said in a short review I wrote, that another author, science fantasy, Philip Pullman, I believe that it belongs right next to Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass, and that quality too. It's not really a young adult novel. It's got a young adult in it. It's not all for adults. I think mature young adults could also read it. And I hope you go pick it up. Turn Over the Moon. Well, go. You don't have to go anywhere, do you, nowadays, and especially during the pandemic. Go to Amazon. Turn Over the Moon by Ryan Harvey. Pick up Farewell to Turn, the prequel story, at dreamtowermedia.com for absolutely free if you sign up for the newsletter. You sign up for the newsletter, we only send you a newsletter 4 to 6 times a month at first, and after that, usually maybe 3-4 times a month. There may be more because there's a lot of exciting things coming up. And again, thanks to the Kickstarter supporters and to everybody who's supporting Dream Tower Media and is going to support this great book, Turn Over the Moon. Ryan, any last thoughts?
This has been a pretty incredible journey. I'm very proud of the novel. Marion C. Cooper, director of King Kong, when he was asked years later would there be anything he would have done differently about King Kong, he said, "No, it's the best I know how to do." And so I say this because you don't want to ever say that we can't do better. But at this moment, right now, I think Turn Over the Moon is the best I know how to do.
Well, there you go. I think that's a great thing to say. I think in my mind, knowing that Sexy Fantastic magazine is coming up, the first issue is coming in January, and I had a funny thought. I hope the first issue is the worst one I ever do because I want to be so fantastic. And the first issue is amazing already, but it's like, we always want to do better. And let's just say a little word about that, the near future. You're going to be writing a novella about Belda that all the backers are going to be receiving sometime next year. May not be till the end of the year.
I already have a story idea.
Yeah, he's got the idea, but quality takes time, and there's a lot of and Ryan's working on a new novel. It is not a follow-up straight to Turn Over the Moon. We'll talk about that more later, but it's part of the new another series of in the same world that will tie together with Belda called The Sorrow War. That's the other series. But for now, Turn Over the Moon, Book 1, Saga of the Sorrowless. Pick it up. Thanks so much for joining us. And Ryan, it was great to see you, see your face here on Skype and hear your voice again.
It's great to be speaking to people no matter what.
Absolutely agree. And I'm sure you and I will be talking probably in a few hours.
Yeah.
All right, bud. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Well, another great conversation, and it was really great to hear from Ryan again. I haven't talked to him in a while.
Yeah, it was really great to hear his voice. And you know what? You guys have inspired me to start my own crowdfunding campaign.
Oh, really? What are you thinking of, what are you doing?
I want to start my own show.
Your own show? What about this one, pal?
Well, I'll probably still have time for it. I'll try to fit it in.
I'll try to fit. That's nice. So what's the show going to be about?
It's going to be about me. The Edgar the Raven Show. With your host, Edgar the Raven. What? With Robert the Human.
Howdy do.
What, don't you like it?
Needs work.
Hey!
See you next time, folks.